GCSE warfare through time. We're now moving on to the impact of warfare on civilians during the period 1700 to 1900. The first point to make here is that no wars were fought in the country during this period, because wars are tending to be fought overseas now, involving the British Army. However, there is still an impact, obviously, on the civilians in the country in terms of recruitment, the cost, the expense of wars, and as you get closer to 1900, you are starting to see one or two technological developments in terms of war reporting and communications. So, recruitment still was still negatively impacted on ordinary people. The 1757 Militia Act, for example, was hated, and an estimated 10% of the population fought during the Napoleonic Wars early in the 19th century. You're also starting to see women become recruited during this period for campaigns overseas. Famously, you've got the nurses in the Crimean War, Mary Seacole and Florence Nightingale. Soldiers were still billeted in people's homes throughout the 18th century. However, this gradually became less of an issue. For example, during the Napoleonic Wars, soldiers began to be stationed in purpose-built barracks. By 1812, there were 168 barracks, housing about 133,000 soldiers. Taxes continued to be used to fund wars, so income tax would go up during big campaigns, like during the Napoleonic Wars and during the Crimean Wars. Taxes going up, hugely unpopular and did cause hardship. It must be pointed out, though, that there is a big increase in population at that time, just before the Industrial Revolution takes off in Britain. So this did allow that tax burden to be shared out a little bit more than ever before. Now, by the time you get to the Crimean War in the 1850s, the electric telegraph has been invented. The reading of newspapers had become a little bit more common. So you do have long reports, such as the very famous critical account of the charge of the Light Brigade for the Times newspaper by William Howard Russell. It had to go by ship, the report. It took about 20 days before it was printed. It did lead to a little bit of pressure for army reform, and also we're starting to see changing social attitudes to conflict now. However, you still must remember that the population is mostly illiterate still at this point, that they don't have the vote, so they don't have political rights, and there's still that romantic image of the famous Wellington victory at Waterloo and the traditions of service in the army, which are going to act as limitations to war reporting. Crimean War of the 1850s was the first one that was photographed too, most famously by photographer Roger Fenton. But these shots, because of the limited technology, tended to be static, staged, posed, nothing negative as well that was going to be published. You still haven't got the technology for action shots, and basic silent film wasn't yet possible. Most newspapers during this period still used war artists as well, and you could paint the images how you wanted them to be painted. So overall, there is some change in the impact of warfare on civilians during this period, notably from the 1850s, as you're starting to getting people back at home to have more of an insight into what war was actually like through the growing technology leading to reports and photographs being seen by the population.